the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. You know, on this program from time to time, we like to give you a little bit of historical background, and certainly during the month of October, because we were coming up to the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, we did a number of programs about Martin Luther. Those were programs which really gave us an understanding of the Reformation, understanding of Martin Luther, and whether it was Erwin Lutzer by phone or Eric Metaxas in studio or Reg Grant in studio or a variety of others. We spent some time talking about that. Today, just before we get into some of the news a little bit later in the program, I wanted to highlight another individual, and that is Charles Haddon Spurgeon. If you're not familiar with him, he's oftentimes been referred to as the Prince of the Preachers. Born in 1834, died in 1892. Of course, was preaching at New Park Street Chapel. Then, of course, it became Metropolitan Tabernacle, known for unbelievable sermons, which are quoted even to this day, known for some of the hymns that he did and for a variety of other things. And because there is a new Bible out called the Spurgeon Study Bible, we thought this would be a great opportunity for us to educate you about him and about this resource that is available. We are privileged to bring back to the microphone Pastor Alistair Begg, who is the senior pastor at Parkside Church in Cleveland, Ohio. He also, of course, is the Bible teacher that many of you hear on the various radio stations that carry his program and ours, Truth for Life. And also, of course, is an individual that graduated from Theological College in London, served 2 churches in Scotland before coming to Ohio, and is very much involved as the general editor of this Bible. We have information about Truth for Life. We have information about the Bible that you can order. And we also have a video that I want you to watch. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. That's something that you can watch and then post on your Facebook page and educate some others. But Alistair Begg, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby. It's nice to get a chance to talk to you.
One of the things we'd love to do before we get into the Bible per se, and I'm going to quote from some of the things that I found in it, and I'm sure you will as well, is educate a few of our listeners about Charles Haddon Spurgeon. I recognize after traveling around all over the United States and meeting some of our listeners that there's some people that have a Spurgeon book or maybe have had a pastor mention him and they're familiar. There are others that may say, Charles Haddon Spurgeon, never heard the name before. Can you give us a little bit of background?
Yes, certainly I can. As you said, you know, his life spanned essentially Victorian England, and he was, you know, the most famous preacher in Victorian England by a long, long margin. And his sort of meteoric rise from very, very ordinary beginnings could only be attributed to the fact that, you know, God has had his hand upon his life. And, you know, when we think about the impact of individuals now via social media, it almost pales in comparison to the fact that his sermons were being printed almost immediately upon completion.
Yes.
And were being distributed. And, you know, they said that you could pick them up in railway stations in the Highlands of Scotland, and as many as 25,000 were printed at a time. And the people that attended his church, along with, you know, the usual mass of humanity, it was not unusual for members either of the royal household or for members of Parliament to attend his services. He's arguably more famous, Kerby, in America than he is even in his home town.
Well, and again, I have a pastor that quotes from him all the time, and even an associate pastor that quotes from him, and made the trip to his grave, which is in the video we'll talk about in just a minute. But let me elaborate on that for a little bit, because, you know, that Metropolitan Tabernacle, I think at that time was the largest church edifice in the world. So you had about seating 5,000 people, standing room for another 1,000. As I understand, he'd write out his sermons, but then he'd only carry like notes to the pulpit, and he'd have stenographers then kind of take down the sermon. Then he would modify it a little bit, and then you could get his weekly sermons, I think, were sold for a penny each. And it just shows you, again, how he was using, if you will, kind of like what we talked about just a few weeks ago, the Gutenberg Bible. He was, in that day, using the best technology of his day so that not just the 5,000 or 6,000 people heard him, but other people were able to read his reprinted sermons and give an opportunity to have a much greater impact. And certainly he was kind of the celebrity of the time, wasn't he?
He certainly was, and as you say, you know, he wrote those sermons out, and then he reduced them to some kind of structured notation. And one of the nice things about the Bible is that there are a few of those actual sermon notes contained in the Bible, both in terms of his own handwritten page, and then in case people can't read his handwriting, they've got it transcribed on the other page. But no, that's absolutely right. The famous times when he was in the Crystal Palace, where there were, 20,000 people in there. It's quite remarkable to think of the fact that he spoke in those places without even any electronic magnification, and which probably says something about the structure, but also about the peculiar voice that God had given him.
And unbelievable. Let me just read one of many that I'm going to read today. This one, it was in 2 Corinthians. God loves us with a father's love, guides us with a father's care, protects us with a father's watchfulness, instructs us with a father's wisdom, bears with us with a father's patience, and longs for us with a father's longing. What an incredible if you will, wordsmith in terms of the way in which he would put various sentences together, words together, and then just a great orator as well, wasn't he?
Yeah, he really, really was. And the fascinating thing, of course, is that although he established his own college for pastors, he never went to college himself. I mean, he was obviously a genius. I mean, he was peculiarly well read. And they have a substantial part of his library out in Kansas City and at Midwestern Baptist Seminary. And when you get a chance to look at that and you realize the breadth of this young man's reading, and also he must have had an unbelievable memory. And yes. he loved language, and I think that's one of the reasons as you share that quote from, I think it's 2 Corinthians 7.
Yes,
it's an illustration of just an immense ability.
One of the things I appreciate, too, about this, and let me talk about this and we'll take a break, is that in many cases, as you said, there will be handwritten notes. I'm looking now at one in Matthew, Gethsemane's Sorrow. And so you can either read it on the left-hand side of the page or they're transcribed. And then as each particular book of the Bible begins, it gives you a general overview and then something that Charles Haddon Spurgeon said about it. And then all through the various parts of the Bible are various quotes as well as extensive references, footnotes, endnotes, and the rest. So we'll come back and talk a little bit more about the relevance of Charles Spurgeon. After all, a man in Victorian England in the 19th century. What relevance might he have in the 21st century? Also want to talk to Pastor Alistair Begg about the influence that Charles Haddon Spurgeon had on his preaching and his teaching. And this is just a way to educate you about some very important people that you need to get to know. And last month we spent quite a bit of time talking about Martin Luther. Today we're going to talk just a little bit about Charles Haddon Spurgeon, but also encourage you to find out more about the Spurgeon Bible. You can go to our website, and as you click on the button that says See More, you will see that we have an opportunity for you to find out more about Pastor Alistair Begg, about truthforlife.org, as well as about the Bible. We'll take a break. Come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, we all know that the cost of living varies from state to state and from city to city. The Tax Foundation has produced a map that shows the real value of $100 in each state. Prices for the same goods are often much cheaper in Missouri or Mississippi than they are in New York or California. The same amount of money can buy more in low-price states than in high-price states. The first thing you notice by looking at the map is the obvious correlation with politics. In general, the low-price states are the red states, and the high-price states are the blue states. The West and Northeast are not only the blue states, but they also have less buying power. The red states clustered in the South and the Midwest have more buying power. The regional differences are striking. Alan Cole, writing for the Tax Foundation, explains that the real purchasing power is 36% greater in Mississippi than it is in the District of Columbia. Put another way, you need an after-tax income in the D.C. area of about $68,000 to equal the after-tax income of $50,000 in Mississippi. To compensate, government and businesses often pay higher salaries in these high-priced states. He also compares the states of California and Nebraska. People in these two states earn approximately the same amount in dollars per capita, but after adjusting for regional price parity, people in Nebraska can buy much more. There's an obvious difference as well within a state. The cost of living in Manhattan, for example, is much greater than living in the Adirondacks in upstate New York. These differences in the cost of living also have policy implications. Most economic policies, like tax brackets and food stamp eligibility, set at the national level, do not take into account the significant differences in the cost of living. This map is a reminder that $100 goes much further in some parts of America than in others. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Pastor Alistair Begg as we talk about the Spurgeon Study Bible. It is just out. First of all, this would make a great present for anybody that wants to study God's Word, but especially is maybe either very familiar with Charles Haddon Spurgeon and would like to dig into that, or even for somebody that is not and would learn so much from an individual that preached so many famous sermons and certainly was lauded during his time and is still referred to as the Prince of the Preachers. Pastor Begg, for just a minute, let's talk about you, because you have, on the video that I'm going to talk about in just a minute, talk about how much this individual, Charles Haddon Spurgeon, influenced you. And again, for some people saying, well, somebody writing in the 19th century, somebody preaching in the 19th century, what relevance would that have today in the 21st century? What's his impact on you?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think people who have conviction, people who stand in the face of the challenges of their times, often then have a relevance beyond their own era. I mean, if we think about it in political terms, I mean, people are still quoting Ronald Reagan today, and they're still quoting Margaret Thatcher, and many of them are wondering what would happen if either one of them were to return and see the circumstances we're in, because, you know, she was the Iron Lady, and the impact of her life extended beyond its earthly span. And in many ways that is true of Spurgeon, because Spurgeon was finally up against the fact that the people who had been around him, particularly within the framework of the Baptist denomination, had begun to lose their sense of security and conviction about the authority and the sufficiency of the Bible. And when he took a stand for that, then he was greatly opposed. And yet, had he not taken a stand for that, then things would have been very, very different. In many ways, he was in the line of Martin Luther, whom you've been quoting earlier, in that, he stood for that. And so, as a student of church history and as a pastor within the framework of, Baptist life in the UK, it's pretty well impossible to avoid the name of Spurgeon. And so you either loved him and wanted to emulate him, or I guess you regarded him as the renegade that some people thought he was. I was in the former category and benefited greatly from reading, for example, his lectures to his students.
One of the things that he dealt with then, it seems like we're still dealing with now. And last month we talked about this idea of sola scriptura, of the scripture. But he lived at a time in which you had, first of all, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, and we're still dealing with that, faith and science to this day. Also during the time when you had the development of what's called the Wellhausen hypothesis, or the documentary hypothesis. So, and that was the challenge on biblical authority. So in some respects, even though he was dealing with the beginnings of that in the 19th century, are we not still dealing with some of the after effects here in the 21st century?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Kerby, and I think that's one of the reasons that Lifeway said, let's take some of this material and put it together in a Bible, so that for the first time in many instances, people can have an opportunity to see just how applicable his observations remain, despite the fact that we're more than 100 years on from when he lived.
And there was what was called the downgrade controversy. And again, let's just talk about that for a second, because I want our listeners to recognize that some of these battles that we have, say, for example, the Baptist had a battle. He was a Baptist, of course, in a different sense. But, you had this modernist versus fundamentalist. The downgrade controversy was all the idea of whether we're sort of downgrading all sorts of beliefs about Christ's atonement, the incarnation, the virgin birth. So these battles that we have today were certainly very significant battles that he fought back in the 19th century.
Yes, and I think that again is one of the things that points to his helpfulness, in that we can look back and see that he was dealing with very similar circumstances, and learning from his example of being able to hold the line, if you like. He was combative, but he was also very kind. And even those whom he found himself in opposition with, he still treated them with grace and with courtesy. He didn't deviate from his course. And sometimes, in these kind of controversial circumstances, the animosity factor looms so large that the arguments and the discussions are almost lost sight of in the rhetoric. And Spurgeon is a wonderful example of someone who was able to hold to his convictions and yet do so in a way in which he didn't make enemies because of his approach. They opposed him because of his convictions.
Sure. And again, he, I think, was a model of civility, which we talk about so often, in the fact that he would disagree without being disagreeable. He would, of course, another illustration of the fact that he probably was a genius is not only was he a great orator and a great writer and wordsmith, he also wrote hymns. That's pretty rare. And even, matter of fact, if I remember right, challenged one of the hymn books that came out at the time. So he really saw the importance of hymns. He saw the importance of teaching theology through hymns as well, didn't he?
Yes, he did, and in that he was right on, wasn't he? I mean, that's essentially what the Gettys and others are doing today. They're saying, as a congregation sings, so it goes. And one of the ways in which we inculcate truth in the hearts and minds of children is with good melody lines and good lyrics. And Spurgeon realized that he would have been somewhat overwhelmed by many of the worship bands and everything that are present today, but he would have been glad of every good lyric, every good piece of theology that was well sung. I think he could have stood behind and rejoiced in.
Yes, we had Keith Getty on. Of course, Keith and Kristen Getty have been on with us before, so we talked about the importance of hymns. But let's, if we can, for just a few minutes, then now talk about the Spurgeon Study Bible itself. And the first thing I want to assign to our listeners is, if you can go to our website today, we have this introductory video. It's a YouTube video, so it's easy to find on YouTube if you want, but we have it on our website. It's a little over 3.5 minutes long, and so this is an opportunity for you to actually see the graveside of Charles Haddon Spurgeon. You get to see Alistair Begg, and you get to see a little bit about the Bible. So the first thing I would encourage you to do is watch that. It's only going to take a little bit more than 3 minutes out of your time. And then there's a share button there, and I would encourage you to take that and then hit that share button and put it on your Facebook page, or maybe send it to someone, or maybe put it on as a Twitter post or something like that, so that you can educate some others about this idea of the Spurgeon Study Bible. But Alistair, for just a minute, talk about it, because you were talking about 58 extracted sermon illustrations, 314 Spurgeon quotables, the biography of him, and all sorts of other material. But as the general editor, tell me exactly what individuals will find when they purchase it in a bookstore or order it online and begin to open it up.
Well, first of all, they'll find a very readable translation of the Bible itself. You know, Broadman and Hallman have worked diligently on their particular translation, and they have essentially rebranded it as the CSB. And one of the ways in which they are encouraging others to turn to it is by means of various particular Bibles that they've created. The Spurgeon Study Bible is unique. I mean, there are a lot of study Bibles. In fact, when they came to me, first of all, and I said, well, do we really need another study Bible? And then they said, well, we've got study Bibles of contemporary pastors, but nobody has ever thought of taking, stuff out of the 19th century and doing it in this way. And the more they pressed that home, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized how wonderfully helpful it was. And so it's not a study Bible in the same way as, for example, others that are available to us today. Because Spurgeon, as we know in his preaching, did not comment on every single passage of the Bible. And so it has a freshness to it and an insight to it. And I just love the way it's laid out. It's laid out very, very nicely. And as you've already noted, Kerby, the places in it where you have unearthed sermons that have not appeared anywhere before.
Amazing.
And it very helpfully in its indexes shows you where the quotes can be found, his illustrations, all of the various study notes are there at the bottom of the page. And I took a copy home to my wife the other day, and I said, I think you are going to, and it sounded strange almost, I said, I think you're going to really enjoy this Bible in the sense that it introduces you to material that can be found anywhere else and in this way.
Very good. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll keep Pastor Alistair Begg for just a little bit longer, but perhaps some of you have some comments or questions. Maybe you have certainly been familiar with Charles Haddon Spurgeon and would like to make a comment or ask a question or like to know more about the Bible. We'll keep him over for just a little bit longer and give you a chance if you'd like to join us. That number is 1-800-351-1212. Are you familiar with Charles Haddon Spurgeon? We'd love to hear from you. We'll be back right after this.
Affirm Films and Sony Pictures Animation present The Star, the fully animated story of the first Christmas told through a whole new set of eyes. Bo the donkey and his stable of animal friends follow the star to become some unlikely heroes.
That light, that's the star. This is where it's been leading me. What's his name?
His name is Jesus.
The Star, in theaters November 17th. More information is available at thestarmovie.com.
If you were homeless and on the run, all because you love Jesus, would you want Christians to step up and help? Our family in the Middle East, the cradle of our faith, is in desperate need because of ISIS and other persecutors. Point of View urges you to support the Cradle Fund today to help these precious believers. Please give at pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or write Cradle Fund in the memo of your check to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Pastor Alistair Begg as we talk about the Spurgeon Study Bible, Christian Standard Bible, CSB. And if you would like to join us, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. We've talked about the impact of Charles Haddon Spurgeon, the Prince of Preachers. We've talked a little about hymns and things of that nature. And we do have some calls coming in. I'll get to those in just a minute. But Alistair, on the video that I've encouraged people to watch, there's a place where you mentioned that Charles Haddon Spurgeon's approach to Scripture really had an impact in your own ministry in preaching. Would you mind maybe sharing that with some of our listeners?
Yes, I think more than anything else, his clarity, if you like, and his simplicity. He was very concerned to make sure that those who were his students did not get themselves all tied up in technical theological terms and high-sounding phraseology and make themselves sound really clever, and yet at the same time make it very difficult for people to understand. Clearly, Spurgeon had great capacity, but as like so many very effective communicators, he was able to distill that in such a way that even children in the congregation and folks of a more modest education were able to benefit from it. And I've always been a terrific fan of people who can take something that's pretty complex and hard and make it known to people in a way that is both clear and simple. And so in terms of his clarity, in terms of his simplicity, in terms of his theological conviction, where he's standing for the sufficiency and the authority of Scripture and so on, these things and more besides, have just sort of chased me down through the corridors of time and have made me an unashamed fan of Spurgeon.
Let me just mention the book and the Bible for a minute, just to give some people an idea of what it involves. Each one of the books of the Bible has kind of the circumstances of the writing, some of the contributions, how it fits within the Bible, its structure, and then usually some comment by Spurgeon on that particular book. And as you said, not all of those are covered. But again, you have a biography about him. You have the study notes from 20 different Spurgeon sermons. You have the 58 different extracted sermon illustrations, which are actually alongside 314 Spurgeon quotations. And for some of us that had access to maybe like the Banner of Truth booklet of Spurgeon or something like this, it is nice to have it in one nice format where you can really benefit from this great orator from the 19th century who really speaks to our day today in the 21st century, doesn't he?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that is so well put. I've got I have Spurgeon's Treasury of David, his monumental work on the Psalms. I have his lectures to his students.
Yeah.
All kinds of books. But it's really quite wonderful to have this compendium as it's tied to the text of Scripture. And I think that's his great value.
Well, let's take some phone calls along the way. We'll head to West Virginia first. Rudy, you're on with Pastor Alistair Begg. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you so much for taking my call. Good afternoon, Alistair. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Nice to hear from you.
Your literature and writings are extremely unique and interesting, to say the least. I do have a question very specific as to the book of Enoch, or what we have of the book of Enoch, in chapter 6, found in the Pentateuch, Genesis.
Go ahead.
There are two implications that I've been studying under Darius Spinoza and his writings out of Jerusalem. It would suggest that the matter where the sons of God found the daughters of men to be fairly and came unto them, if this would be a spiritual event. What is your take on that, sir?
Well, it's interesting you should mention that, because I'm just turning to that passage now in the Spurgeon Bible, and here's another way in which Spurgeon has an influence on me, in that he was very, very concerned to take on the challenges of the day that tackled, if you like, the sufficiency of the Bible, its authority, and so on, the atonement of Christ. But when it came to questions like this, more esoteric questions, you find him virtually silent.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And I think it's because he realized that what Paul says in his pastoral epistles about the matters are so crucial in Ephesus, the concerns of the gospel are so significant in Crete, that he warns Timothy and he warns Titus about getting essentially tied up in these kind of things. And so it's a long and a roundabout road for me to say that I don't have a comment on the question that you're asking. Certainly not one that would be helpful to you or would be helpful to our listeners in general, because I would have to really think it out with you in a way that this kind of format does not allow us the opportunity to do. But I thank you for the call.
One of the things you did mention just in passing is he was really dealing with some major issues. I mentioned, for example, the challenge to the Bible, Darwin's theory of evolution. Yep. Even at that time, you still had the remnants of slavery. I know that he was strongly opposed the owning of slaves. Actually, I believe he lost some of the support from the Southern Baptists because of that. So these were big issues in the 19th century, and some of them remain to this day. We don't have slavery today, but we have racial relations. We have issues related to things like the theory of evolution or biblical authority. Might as well spend our time majoring on the majors, because those are enough to consume our day, aren't they?
Well, that I think is to fall in line with Spurgeon, and so it's again one of the ways in which I feel that his influence is strong and helpful.
Let's, if we can, just before I let you go, because I know we have to let you go just at the next break here, talk about some of the resources that we've made available. First of all, you can click on the picture of the Bible. I'm sure you'll be able to find it in your local bookstore, but there's a way for you to order it there, and you can find out a little bit more. Number two, as I've mentioned, we have the video there, which is a little over 3 minutes long. And so I would encourage you to watch the video and to then maybe hit that share button. There's a little arrow there that allow you to put it on a Facebook page or maybe send it to someone by email. But also, Pastor Alistair Begg, let me talk for just a minute about the fact we also have a link to truthforlife.org. Now, I know that most of the radio stations that carry this program probably carry yours, but there may be some people that for the first time are getting a chance to meet you or have never taken the time to go to your website. So talk about what's available on your website, Truth for Life, when they land there, because there's some great resources for all of our listeners.
Yeah, it's a constant amazement to me. I mean, I go on it in the morning because I use the daily devotional. And actually, the daily devotional is the material that I edited of Spurgeon's morning and evening. And so they have that. So on a daily basis, they have what Spurgeon had to say concerning the day, whether it's today, the 13th of November, or whatever else it is. They have access to 2,000 sermons that I don't listen to, but people tell me are quite helpful. And our folks do a tremendous job of uploading materials such as you're suggesting. The books that we have found to be helpful in our own libraries, we're sharing with others. It's actually a pretty good compendium, Kerby, and I thank you for mentioning it.
Well, again, let me encourage you to go to the bookstore there. I have a number of Alistair Begg books, and of course, I have not been in Cleveland anytime soon, but when I am, I'll certainly go to Parkside Church, get a chance to hear him at Camp of the Woods and other places. And even though he'll have to go, I'll continue taking some of those phone calls that some of you have. And again, I wanted to thank you for, first of all, giving us some time out of your very busy day. And thank you for taking the time to help them put together the Spurgeon Study Bible. It's a Christian Standard Bible. It's available in your local bookstore, but we have some links to it as well on our website. And Pastor Alistair Begg, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. It's a privilege. It's always nice to talk with you.
We're going to take a break, and then I'll take some more of those phone calls on the screen there. So if you would like to join us and talk about theology, we can do that. We're also going to get into a couple of other issues. We have the issue of tax reform before Congress. A lot of people wonder, how are we going to, in the state of Alabama, vote for the Senate race? And so there are a lot more other issues we will get into today, but we wanted to use this as an occasion, occasionally, to really spend some time educating you about a couple of key people that are very influential in church history. Of course, last month we talked about Martin Luther. This particular 45 minutes, we spent some time talking about Charles Haddon Spurgeon. This may be the first time you've heard about him. I hope you'll take the time to find out more and to learn about God's Word from some of these heroes of the faith. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito recently gave remarks to a group in New Jersey. His 45-minute presentation proved to be quite sobering. Justice Alito is a proven defender of religious liberty. You may recall he authored the court's opinion in Hobby Lobby, protecting the religious consciences of family-owned businesses. In other opinions, he has warned of the impact the sexual revolution may inflict upon the religious liberty of Americans. In his latest remarks, however, Justice Alito told the audience, quote, "You don't need to be a weatherman to know which way the wind is blowing. A wind is picking up that is hostile to those with traditional moral beliefs," unquote. But the good justice ended with a word of caution and challenge. He said, quote, "We are likely to see pitched battles in courts and Congress, state legislatures, and town halls. But the most important fight is for the hearts and minds of our fellow Americans. It is up to all of us to evangelize our fellow Americans about the issue of religious freedom," unquote. That's where you and I come in. Freedom, and especially religious freedom, is not a given in human history. It is something each generation must renew for itself. Telling the story of religious liberty and its blessings to one another is part of our responsibility as Americans. It's also how we preserve liberty. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's get back into some of the issues in the news, but every once in a while I like to educate us about a major figure in church history. I have found that when sometimes I teach that in a Sunday school class or mention that when I'm teaching maybe in a Bible college or something like that, they say, "I've never even heard of Spurgeon," and so at least you can say that you have. I'm going to get back into some of the news, and again, I might give you a program note that a week from this Wednesday, that'd be the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I think we'll do our annual teaching about Thanksgiving. We'll make available again the Thanksgiving quiz. I suspect I'll maybe even dress up again in studio here as a pilgrim, which I've done before, and will educate you about the history, godly history of America, the story of the Pilgrims and Squanto, and maybe we'll get into the Puritans and maybe the National Days of Prayer and a few other things. So that'll be a teaching we'll be doing a week from this Wednesday, but I just thought I'd mention that as another chance to digress briefly from some of the issues in the news. But let's get back into the news. And one of the big issues before Congress right now is the tax code. No, I haven't forgotten Judge Roy Moore. We'll get into that in the second hour, especially for our listeners in Alabama. What do you do in light of these allegations? Do you vote for this individual? Does he get replaced? We'll get into some of that in the second hour, but I thought just for the short few minutes we have before the top of the hour, I would read a little bit from a piece by George Will called Repeal and Replace the Tax Code, because he says the Republicans' tax bill would somewhat improve the existing revenue system that once caused Mitch Daniels, who was the former head of the Office of Management and Budget, former Indiana governor, to say, wouldn't it be nice to have a tax code that looked as though it had been designed on purpose? I'm going to come back to that in just a minute, because the tax code does not look like it was designed on purpose. Even the bill that is being considered right now, 429 pages, it's, as he said, apt to grow and an implausible instrument of simplification. I mean, how do you simplify a tax code when the replacement adds 429 pages? I mean, you can kind of start seeing the problem with this as well. But anyway, he says today's tax code is a circumstance, and the Republican bill will exacerbate this by expanding the $1,000 child credit to $1,600 with an additional $300 family credit for each parent and non-child dependent, and by doubling the standard deduction to $12,000 for individuals and $24,000 for married couples. These measures would increase the number of persons not paying income taxes and would further decrease the percentage of income tax revenues paid by lower income earners. So again, the concern that you might have about some of this is already we have a situation in which the top 5% pay 58% of all of the taxes. The bottom 50%, essentially, I'm rounding it off a little bit, pay no taxes. So this is going to increase that percentage even more. Here's a fact that I'm going to put in a future commentary, which I had not paid attention till George Will mentioned it. He says already 62%, or almost two-thirds, of American households pay more in payroll taxes than in income taxes. And the bottom 5% of earners supply less than 3% of income tax revenues. Of course, as I said, that's going to be probably almost zero by the time we get there. 45% of American households pay no income tax, either because they earn too little or because they qualify for enough exemptions and credits to erase their liability. So again, as I said, it's less than 50%. It's going to be almost 50% by the time some of this gets implemented. And I don't necessarily think that is a good thing. You've heard me on this program before, if you've listened any length of time, to say that I think everybody should pay some tax, even if it's $1, even if it's a person under the poverty level have to donate a can to the food bank or something. I really think it's important to have everybody have a stake in the game. It makes sense for the top earners to pay much of it. Got that. Figured that out a long time ago. That's always the way it's going to be. But when you have almost half of the nation not paying taxes, that's not a good thing. If you've ever been to a country, for example, I'll pick Saudi Arabia, or you can take a variety of other Middle Eastern countries that get so much of their revenue from oil, you have very few people that even have any political interest because, after all, there's no skin in the game. They don't really care. And, of course, a lot of those are monarchies anyway, or dictatorships, so they really don't have a democracy. But even if they did, you can see that if you don't really pay taxes, you don't really care about tax reform. And so that, I think, is probably one of the difficulties we have right now. As long as the top 5% pay 58%, we're good with that. Top 10% pay 69%. That's all we care about. Let the rich people pay, and the rest of us just, turn a blind eye to it. So the problem that George Will points out is that you have implemented into the tax code all sorts of variations, carve-outs, as we sometimes call loopholes. And as a result, what you end up with is a system that makes it very difficult oftentimes for individuals or businesses to plan. I'm going to get to the corporate income tax in just a minute, but that's one of those issues that certainly is of great concern. So that's why in his final paragraph, and we've posted this article so you can read it in its entirety, he says this year's best tax bill, which Representative Bob Goodlatte of Virginia has introduced 6 times since 2006, is 4 pages long and contains fewer words, 411, than the new Republican bill has pages. Remember, the Republican bill has 429 pages. This particular bill by the representative has 411 words. He said it could be titled What You Wished For, the Mitch Daniels Act. It is titled with almost unprecedented accuracy, the Tax Code Termination Act. It will nullify the existing 4 million word code as of December 31st, 2021, and require by July 4th of that year it must be replaced by a new one, which would necessarily be one designed on purpose. So the problem we have with the tax code right now is it looks like it was put together by a committee, because it was. And it looks like, as you've always heard people say, what's a camel? It's an animal put together by committee. And so we have that issue. We also have the other issue, and that is the corporate tax rate. And what is so striking is that if we could somehow, through some stroke of creativity, which I hope will actually take place, reduce the corporate income tax from 35% to, say, 20%, what it would do almost instantaneously is repatriate a lot of money overseas. The estimates are that overseas profits for the various U.S. companies are in the range of $2 trillion to $3 trillion. That money would come back, no doubt, and that would be used for all sorts of things. I mean, it could be used for equipment, could be used for labor, research, development. Yeah, some of it would be used to repay debts, but that's not a bad thing. Some of it would return capital to shareholders in forms of dividends. That's not bad because they would be investing too, or they would be spending that money, and it would be one of the most significant economic boons to America that you can possibly imagine. So we'll pay attention to where that tax code is going and how it's being written. But let me take a break, and when we come back, I guess it's about time to come back to the Alabama Republican Senate candidate, Judge Roy Moore. What do we do about these allegations? How should at least our listeners in Alabama vote? And are there some lessons that apply to the rest of us in the other 49 states? So those are some things we'll talk about in the second hour. If you have some opinions, you can even give us a call right now, and I'll put you up first of all. If you would like to know a little bit more about some of the issues we're talking about today, they're all available at the website pointofview.net. We still have an opportunity for you to donate to the Cradle Fund, and most importantly, if you appreciate the material that we make available to you and the conversation, I hope you might click on that button that says donate and support this ministry. Let's take a break. We'll come back and talk about Judge Roy Moore right after this.
Affirm Films and Sony Pictures Animation present The Star, the fully animated story of the first Christmas told through a whole new set of eyes. Bo the donkey and his stable of animal friends follow the star to become some unlikely heroes.
That light, that's the star. This is where it's been leading me. What's his name?
His name is Jesus.
The Star, in theaters November 17th. More information is available at thestarmovie.com.
If you are homeless and on the run, all because you love Jesus, would you want Christians to step up and help? Our family in the Middle East, the cradle of our faith, is in desperate need because of ISIS and other persecutors. Point of View urges you to support the Cradle Fund today to help these precious believers. Please give at pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or write Cradle Fund in the memo of your check to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. You were not with us in the first hour. We had some opportunity to talk with Alistair Begg about the Spurgeon Study Bible, and so that gave us an opportunity to be educated a little bit about Charles Haddon Spurgeon, and we will do that from time to time, sparingly, because we have so many issues in the news. And then we wound up the first hour by talking about George Will's piece, Repeal and Replace the Tax Code. I'll come back to that a little bit later. But this hour, first of all, I think it is about time to come back to the conversation about how at least those of you that are listening in the state of Alabama are going to vote this special election for the Republican state Senate, or Republican U.S. Senate candidate Roy Moore, and the Democratic candidate takes place December 12th. And, of course, we've had the revelations last week about the fact that there were allegations of sexual misconduct. That's a nice way to say some real questions about whether or not he was a sexual predator. And so the question that I want to put on the table and maybe get an answer from some of you is, how do you vote with that uncertainty? If he comes out and says, yes, this happened and I'm asking your forgiveness, that's one thing. I will in just a minute give you some of the quotes from Judge Roy Moore, and so you still have some of the ambiguity that I think, of course, causes a lot of people to wonder. This happened 40 years ago. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but, of course, one of the questions that people have is if indeed there is a pattern of behavior. We don't seem to have seen it since then, at least so far, but there could be another shoe to drop. Then you have the interview that Judge Roy Moore did with Sean Hannity, and on one point says he did not even know Lee Corfman. He says, I didn't know Miss Corfman from anybody. The allegations of sexual misconduct from her are completely false. Okay, but then later on, he's a little more ambiguous about some of these other individuals. For example, he said, when Sean Hannity asked if he had similar relationships, he said, no, not generally. I'm not going to dispute anything. It would have been out of my customary behavior. He said things like, I don't remember going out on dates. I know her as a friend. You know, he made some statements like that. But you also have the fact that the problem with this idea of the denial of knowing Lee Corfman, who's kind of the key person in the Washington Post article, is that you have witnesses at that time, including her mother, and even you have a former deputy district attorney who said that it was common knowledge that Roy Moore dated high school girls back then. Okay, he talked about, I don't remember dating any girl without the permission of her mother. So the first thing is that it's a little questionable in that it's 40 years ago and we haven't seen a pattern since then. This is a person that's been in the public eye for a long time. So to drop this particular bombshell on last week, just a few weeks before the December election, is somewhat questionable. But on the other hand, you have multiple individuals and eyewitnesses and accusers. So that's a sort of another issue that you can have. And so I think it is fair to say that we don't know. Okay, what do you do when you don't know? Some people have said, well, if they turn out to be true and we elect him, that's a problem. Yes, but it's a problem that I think you could possibly deal with. It's already sort of being dealt with anyway. The number of endorsements and financial donations have started to dry up for Judge Roy Moore, so it may be a non-issue. But even let's assume that indeed these allegations are found to be true, then you could see the Republican leadership simply censure him, remove him from office. They couldn't technically, but they could essentially push him out of office, and that will be the end of it. If, however, it comes out on the other side of the equation and he is not elected and finds out that this is, simply been trumped up, you don't really have a recourse then. You have a Democrat that's sitting in the U.S. Senate until the next election. So you've got some issues that are certainly there, and so I would like to begin to maybe have that conversation. Now, as you call in, of course, you can also express other concerns that you may have with Roy Moore or reasons why you believe we should support Roy Moore. But there's a bigger issue here than just this election in Alabama. We are starting to see a trend where you have, and this is not necessarily new, so I don't want to make it sound like it happened the last couple of years. It's happened over the last couple of decades, what has oftentimes been referred to as an October surprise, where just before the November election, you have some October revelation that is dropped so late in the game that there is really no chance for the individual to recover from it, and as a result, that oftentimes causes that particular candidate to be defeated. This game gets played a little too often, and especially by one side, and we also know from last week as we talked with Dr. Miro Matthews that some of those individuals that do this have actually been paid to do so. So that's a concern that I think since relegates this to more than just an Alabama case. I know right now that many of our listeners are in the state of Alabama. Most of the rest of you in 40-plus other states are not in Alabama. So you really don't have to make a decision as to whether or not you would vote for or against Roy Moore. But the issue is broader than just this U.S. Senate race. It's what do you do when that particular kind of game is played, and how do you respond to it effectively? Do you just turn a blind eye to it if there's uncertainty and then hope it gets sorted out later on, or do you act upon it immediately? So those are some very important questions I wanted to put on the table to give you a chance to maybe express your opinion. So let's start with some of the phone calls here. We'll go to Georgia on the Good News Network. And Vivian, what would you say in terms of this particular issue?
Well, being a Christian woman, it bothers me that we actually have two sides of the story. We have Christians who would forgive and move on with their lives. So I don't know if the women are Christian women that have been interrogated. But assuming that Christian people can forgive if in fact it were true, and that Roy Moore is possibly a born-again Christian and has moved on with his life, and his track record since then shows him to be an honorable man. But we're tied up with the unforgiveness and the stone throwing. You know, Jesus said, let he who is without sin throw the first stone. So it's a battlefield, and it's a tragic situation, but what I'm hoping is that Christians who have the capacity to forgive, or even if they are doubting, would forgive, that they would go out and vote. That nobody should be raked over the coals for something they did 40 years ago. I don't know how many people you know could stand that scrutiny, but...
Yeah, and that's another issue. I'm going to take a break here, but that's another issue because there are a lot of people that are saying, I'm not going to run for a public office. I just, 40 years ago I smoked marijuana, but that might be enough to disqualify me, or I may have said something or done something, and so we aren't getting the best people running for office sometimes either because they're fearful about something that happened way past the statute of limitations. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, we all know that the cost of living varies from state to state and from city to city. The Tax Foundation has produced a map that shows the real value of $100 in each state. Prices for the same goods are often much cheaper in Missouri or Mississippi than they are in New York or California. The same amount of money can buy more in low-price states than in high-price states. The first thing you notice by looking at the map is the obvious correlation with politics. In general, the low-price states are the red states, and the high-price states are the blue states. The West and Northeast are not only the blue states, but they also have less buying power. The red states clustered in the South and the Midwest have more buying power. The regional differences are striking. Alan Cole, writing for the Tax Foundation, explains that the real purchasing power is 36% greater in Mississippi than it is in the District of Columbia. Put another way, you need an after-tax income in the D.C. area of about $68,000 to equal the after-tax income of $50,000 in Mississippi. To compensate, government and businesses often pay higher salaries in these high-priced states. He also compares the states of California and Nebraska. People in these two states earn approximately the same amount in dollars per capita, but after adjusting for regional price parity, people in Nebraska can buy much more. There's an obvious difference as well within a state. The cost of living in Manhattan, for example, is much greater than living in the Adirondacks in upstate New York. These differences in the cost of living also have policy implications. Most economic policies, like tax brackets and food stamp eligibility, set at the national level, do not take into account the significant differences in the cost of living. This map is a reminder that $100 goes much further in some parts of America than in others. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I want to stay on the issue of Roy Moore for just another couple of minutes, and if you'd like to join us, we'll take some of those phone calls. This is a difficulty because, on the one hand, it's difficult to dismiss some of these allegations. Matter of fact, today I understand that Gloria Allred has a press conference with another accuser. And so, again, the shoes begin to drop, the endorsements begin to decline, the money begins to decline. And there are a lot of people that say it's really hard to dismiss all of these allegations, except for the fact that the timing seems like an obvious smear from the Washington Post. I mean, they wait till after it is impossible to remove the name of Roy Moore from the ballot. If these came out when you had the primary battle, then it would have, I think, assured that Roy Moore would not be on the ballot, but he is on the ballot, and the opponent, Doug Jones, is on the ballot. But there's a bigger question, and that is the question that you might have. What do you do when you don't know? And it seems to me that in some cases, people are still arguing that electing Roy Moore, and then if you find out later that this was a smear campaign and there's nothing to it, no harm, no foul. If later on we find out that these allegations are true and we should have removed him from the ballot, I think the Republicans can do so. On the other hand, if you elect Doug Jones, he's in there, and then we find out that this was a smear job, well, there's no recourse that I can come up with. So love to get your thoughts about how to address this issue. It's a very important issue for our listeners in Alabama. The rest of us just kind of sit back and watch it. But I'd love to get your thoughts about how to respond in a situation where there are very serious allegations, but at the same time where there's still a little bit of ambiguity. So let's go back to the phones in Florida. George, what would you counsel for us as we talk about this issue?
Yeah, hi, thank you. I don't think it's a complicated issue at all. I mean, I think that, thankfully we live in the United States of America where, we're innocent until proven guilty, last I checked. And having lived in various different countries, that's not always the case outside of these borders. But, that's one of the reasons that, we are such an exceptional place. And I think that Judge Roy Moore deserves that. The fact that now you can be tried by the media and convicted, so to speak, in people's minds, I think is absolutely ridiculous. I think the other woman who just called in too had some excellent points. All this casting of stones and whatnot, I don't know why people are constantly looking as well for candidates that are perfect, right? Like, since when was that the standard? Because last I remember, over 2,000 years ago, right, we had the perfect candidate and we still crucified him.
Yes.
So, so what? How is it that we have to hold everybody else out of this standard? But the timing of it, the fact that Jeff Bezos leads, the Washington Post, the fact that these are clearly just very aggressive tactics by the liberal side of the debate, right? I mean, I don't think it's just a matter for Alabama. I think it's very important that we all keep in mind that this will set a precedent as to the blueprint or the playbook that unfortunately so many other so-called Americans are going to take toward people that they despise, toward an ideology that they don't agree with. Because remember, this party, and it's not even just the Democrats, because it's the fact that we have so-called conservatives on the Republican side, like Mitch McConnell and McCain and Flake, that that are constantly siding, with these other, with not just with these tactics, but with this ideology, and they still hold themselves out to be conservatives. So it's like, to me, both parties are now indistinguishable. So it's important for us to just not forget what it is that we're looking for, right? We're looking for a candidate with actual ideas and that's going to actually uphold the Christian values that this country was founded upon. And if Roy Moore turns out to be guilty, then fine. But I think it also sets a bad precedent that, I guess every candidate now is going to be investigated. That's the tactic now. Even once they get in, now we have to, hold everything up, kind of like with the investigations of Trump. So to me, it's nothing but a smear job. But obviously, I guess there is a possibility he could be lying. But let's wait and see. Let that run its course.
Sure. Well, and I appreciate you because you get why I'm bringing this up, because I see this as a precedent-setting kind of event that could really just become the standard playbook, because then you can make all sorts of allegations, and those allegations don't necessarily have to be true, but just the allegations alone are enough to derail and eventually doom a candidacy. So I think you get the point.
The hypocrisy behind it, too, is that, how much look at these other cases where we actually do have much more than just supposition, where you have actual, I guess, pretty ponderous evidence against, like, Hillary Clinton with Uranium One and a whole, slew of other things. Like, what does it take to get those people in jail? Like, I don't know how they're just made of Teflon. And yet, somehow you can cast aspersions, on the right newspaper, and all of a sudden it's, this guy's doomed.
Yep.
That's
it is.
insane.
You got the point. And, of course, you may have seen the political cartoon where it shows Judge Roy Moore saying, "I've decided to change my name to Senator Menendez." And they go, "Who?" And he says, "Precisely," because they're covering one and not the other. One of the questions Vivian asked is about these women. We did talk about this on Friday briefly, that Deborah Gibson was a campaign volunteer for Hillary Clinton's campaign. Doesn't discount what she said, but it's something to keep in mind. Whereas Lee Korfman says she's a Republican and voted for Donald Trump. So, you've got to kind of sort some of that out as well. But let's give a few more of you a chance to join our conversation today. Scott, I think, wants to bring an issue up that I talked about on Friday, so I'll give him the chance to do so. Scott, in Missouri, you have the floor. What would you like to add to our conversation today?
Thanks, Kerby. I think this is really about a really bad way of handling what the so-called left is trying to stir up. I personally have some distant cousins who were married in Kentucky. The girl was 13 or 14 when she married a 20-something-year-old. So this type of relationship was not unusual in the 70s in rural America, and I think Roy Moore seems to be handling it really badly. I mean, it seems to me like, yes, okay, I had some interest in some young ladies. This was common in this time period. I had permission from their parents, and that's all it is. 40 years later, I've done nothing of him that would cause, eyebrows to raise in my behavior. So, okay, what's your point? We can judge history through our through lenses that are 40 years of time, but I just think they're handling it really poorly.
Well, again, there are some things that I've said before that you could learn. And first of all, let's not try to use Scripture or Joseph and Mary as a justification. So that went the wrong direction, and that one just, I think, offended almost everybody, certainly evangelicals. But on the other hand, as I said before, the American people are very forgiving. If you simply say, look, I did have permission from the mother. I did date some teenage girls. This did happen. This did not happen. I asked your forgiveness. It was 40 years ago. I learned a lesson. Almost all of us at one time or another, Scott, have done something in our youth that we look back and go, ooh, or we said, that was a mistake, or I almost made a mistake. That could be sex. It could be drugs. It could be just taking a selfie picture and you're leaning over a building and realize, I almost killed myself just then, or driving a car, whatever. People recognize that if indeed he saw that maybe this wasn't a good idea, if we had 40 years of this happening, the American people would not be forgiving. If this happened 40 years ago and this man has been in the public eye for so long and there's no evidence since then, I think most Americans would forgive that in a moment. Don't you think?
I do. I mean, that's part of what our society is built on. We are built on, okay, we might incarcerate somebody for something, then they are paroled. The expectation is, okay, you've served your time, you've been punished, now go out and lead a better life. And we all have skeletons in our closet, and yet, man, I don't know. I just think they're handling this really, really badly.
I agree with you. Well, I need to take a break, and Scott, you brought up a point that I thought is not well handled. There's another lesson there for those of you that are future candidates. If you've got something in your past, get it out early, admit it. People are very forgiving, but again, you can think of these October surprises. How about in 2000? All of a sudden we find out that Governor George W. Bush had a DUI. That was before he decided to give up drinking at all, and that's dropped at the 11th hour. And so this kind of game has been played a few times already at the presidential level, the senatorial level, and boy, the game's played all the time in local politics. And I just, again, have a question. How do we respond when there are allegations and we don't have all the facts? How do you vote? I see a few more of you have some comments, so we'll extend this a little bit longer because this is an issue not just for Alabama, but a principle we can apply no matter where we find ourselves. We'll be right back.
Affirm Films and Sony Pictures Animation present The Star, the fully animated story of the first Christmas told through a whole new set of eyes. Bo the donkey and his stable of animal friends follow the star to become some unlikely heroes.
That light, that's the star. This is where it's been leading me. What's his name?
His name is Jesus.
The Star, in theaters November 17th. More information is available at thestarmovie.com.
If you are homeless and on the run, all because you love Jesus, would you want Christians to step up and help? Our family in the Middle East, the cradle of our faith, is in desperate need because of ISIS and other persecutors. Point of View urges you to support the Cradle Fund today to help these precious believers. Please give at pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or write Cradle Fund in the memo of your check to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you just joined us, let me just mention the first hour today, we spent some time with Alistair Begg for a while talking about Charles Haddon Spurgeon and the Spurgeon Study Bible. And if you did not have a chance to hear that, let me encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. This would be a great way to educate you about one of the most significant preachers of the 19th century, oftentimes referred to as the Prince of the Preachers. So we did cover that, talked a little bit about the tax code, but it felt like it's about time to come back to Judge Roy Moore. That's not something we're going to talk about every day this week, but I thought there is a principle here, and that is, what do you do when there are allegations and there's some ambiguity? Now, it's easier when an individual comes out and says, no, this did not happen, and I will prove to you it did not, or when that individual comes out and said, yes, that happened, and it's true. But in this particular case, you got more ambiguity where, at least when Judge Roy Moore, and he's been on the program with us before, but when he was on with Sean Hannity, said that, well, I don't remember going out on dates, but then later on talked about, I don't remember dating any girl without the permission of her mother. Okay, well, it seems like he's saying that some of these individuals have. Gloria Allred today has a press conference. The new accuser says they're Trump supporters. As I mentioned before, Lee Korfman said she's a Republican and supported Donald Trump. But on the other hand, Deborah Gibson was a Clinton campaign volunteer. You've just got a lot of ambiguity. But the bigger issue is, number one, for a candidate, I think if you've got anything in your past, better to get it out early on rather than have it dumped on your campaign at the 11th hour. On the other hand, what do you do if it's not true, or if you as a voter are not sure? Do you elect that person and then hope that later on, if indeed it turns out to be true, that person is removed from office? Or do you trust the allegations and simply not vote for that individual? And so this is an issue broader than just what's happening in Alabama. I think all of us in all the other states around the country that hear this program have to kind of think about what would be your reaction if you found yourself in that particular state of Alabama right now. Would you vote for Roy Moore, or would you vote for Doug Jones? So let's go back to the phones and get some wisdom from some of our callers. South Carolina, WAGP. Robert, what would you add to our conversation today?
Thank you, sir, for taking my call. To me, it's just like everybody is making accusations about everybody. And to me, I know it's most likely a civil matter in this, but if it turns out to be a criminal matter and it's proven false, they should be publicly prosecuted, and it maybe would deter some of it. I mean, I'm not trying to defend Mr. Moore because I don't know the answers. And to me, as a voter, I kind of forget about all this because that's all you're hearing.
Yes.
And it just kind of me, I'm like, okay, here's another one, here's another one, here's another one, even with the actors right now. And it just, to me, is just overblown.
Yeah.
And,
there's a feeding frenzy, isn't there?
Yes. And I mean, I know I'm not trying to belittle these women because it could have happened or it may not have happened. But the problem is why didn't they do this back 30 years ago? And to me, I personally have been involved with a friend that was actually accused of rape. But I was with the person at the time 40 miles away from where this lady was saying that she was being raped at the time, had called 911. And fortunately, a police officer that knew us called us and said, please come to the police department. And fortunately, we had proof that we were in another area. So, I mean, this type of stuff happens all the time, but not trying to belittle the actual things. But I think if the public were to, I mean, even with President Trump, with all these other ladies that came out with him, we hadn't heard anything since that time, anything about it.
Yeah, again, if you were a sexual predator, which is what some people are accusing him of being, then I would think you would see it more than once, and I think you would see a pattern over time. And we don't seem to see that. But that doesn't mean that these allegations aren't true, but it is one issue to put on the table. If, on the other hand, he is completely innocent of everything other than maybe making some bad choices as a 30-year-old going out with teenagers, and I think those are bad choices, by the way. Exactly. It comes back to something I mentioned on Friday, and that is those of us that are older remember a famous question that was asked by Ray Donovan. Ray Donovan served in the Reagan administration. He was accused of some misdoings that were actually resulted in a court case, and he was completely exonerated. But then at the end of the court case, he says, where do I go to get my good name back? Where do I go to get my reputation back? And there is a sense in which the accuser always holds the upper hand. And I think, again, if somebody makes this accusation, I take it real seriously, and I don't think people always lie on it, but when people do, they ruin your reputation, and if you're a big and public figure, you can maybe get your reputation back. But if you're kind of a low-level cabinet officer like Ray Donovan, where do you go to get your reputation back? If somebody accuses you or me, where do we go to get our reputation back? Somebody can make that accusation. I try to defend it, and that is with me the rest of my life. And if somebody does a obituary or a Wikipedia site, it's there forever, even though it has been proven to be untrue. And that's the concern that I also have.
I agree. And also, in the instance that I was part of, a local newspaper, it's a small newspaper, they reported that the next day in there as a headline of this person because he's a businessman.
There you go.
And that newspaper went out of business quickly. And because it got out that it was untrue. And it just, to me, I think what he needs, if this stuff has been proven wrong, I'm understanding it's probably more of a civil matter than a criminal matter, but, sue him for slander and make it public.
Well, we'll see.
And,
Robert, I appreciate you adding that to the conversation today. Let's give a few more, just a chance real quickly before we run out of time today to hear from a number of other callers that would like to add their perspective. And we'll go to the Good News Network in Florida, in this case. Jeannie, thank you for calling today.
Thank you for taking my call. I am totally for Mr. Moore. The reason being, if somebody did something like that, it should have been brought up many, many years ago, not when he's trying to make a thing, and he's had no problems in his past. He has been a remarkably wonderful man. He's done a great job and still does a great job. And if it didn't come in and bite the butt of Bill Clinton and Hillary and all of these other crazy people, why jump on him for something? And the other thing is that the woman has a lot to do with that. She should not have pursued him or tried to make his advances more. If she'd had any self-respect, I was always considered a beautiful woman. And I've had some pretty good jobs where I could have been very much involved with people. But I had a self-respect. And I always would have blamed myself for something. I mean, maybe not entirely, but you know what? People like Roy Moore has never had anything else against him since. And this, all of a sudden, this comes up. I would say the statute of limitations is over for that.
Well, it certainly is. And like you said, it's not a criminal case. And matter of fact, I'm not sure they're pressing that. The argument that is made is that these people have not wanted to come forward. And it was the Washington Post going and sort of even reluctantly getting them to testify to that. But again, I'll just take the next caller. Wants to bring up, the 11th hour when some of these surface certainly raises some questions and some eyebrows. Let's go to Missouri, KNEO. Katie, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, I looked at this, and this looks very political to me. So if I was going to be voting, I could vote for him, I would vote, because I wouldn't want to have a candidate that I don't want because something happened to one I did like. And then if it turned out that it was true, how many times? I mean, people die and you have to have another election. If you had to go out, you just put somebody, but then there would be time for other people to run and you know what you're voting for. So it's too late, and it's got such a political feel to this. It feels like politics being crammed down your throat. So, I mean, I think if it was me, I would consider this a political move, and I would still vote for him.
Okay.
And wait it out. I'd wait it out.
And see what may come. And so, again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Otherwise, I'll move on to a couple of other issues. We're not going to talk about it every day, but it's been one of those questions that more and more people are starting to ask, and that is, well, when there's ambiguity, what do I do? Of course, you know that there have been those that have said, well, this just illustrates that evangelicals and Christians, they just change their behavior. They turned a blind eye to Donald Trump. No, I didn't. I mean, I recognize what we got when, if indeed you were going to vote for him, you turned a blind eye to Roy Moore. No, I'm not at all. But I also recognize that with all these allegations and the ambiguity, that's an important question, too. How do you vote? Can we postpone the election? If we can't, then you got to make a decision. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito recently gave remarks to a group in New Jersey. His 45-minute presentation proved to be quite sobering. Justice Alito is a proven defender of religious liberty. You may recall he authored the court's opinion in Hobby Lobby, protecting the religious consciences of family-owned businesses. In other opinions, he has warned of the impact the sexual revolution may inflict upon the religious liberty of Americans. In his latest remarks, however, Justice Alito told the audience, quote, "You don't need to be a weatherman to know which way the wind is blowing. A wind is picking up that is hostile to those with traditional moral beliefs," unquote. But the good justice ended with a word of caution and challenge. He said, quote, "We are likely to see pitched battles in courts and Congress, state legislatures, and town halls. But the most important fight is for the hearts and minds of our fellow Americans. It is up to all of us to evangelize our fellow Americans about the issue of religious freedom," unquote. That's where you and I come in. Freedom, and especially religious freedom, is not a given in human history. It is something each generation must renew for itself. Telling the story of religious liberty and its blessings to one another is part of our responsibility as Americans. It's also how we preserve liberty. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talking about what to do when you have these kinds of allegations. The most recent accuser comes up and sounds like maybe even we're talking about predation or some kind of force. And these are the kind of questions we are faced with when a few weeks before a special election, the bomb is dropped. this could have been dropped a long time ago when you talk about those individuals that were actually involved in that particular case. And so you can also begin to wonder whether or not some of this was orchestrated by those in the Democratic Party or by those in the Washington Post. But again, let's give a few more of you a chance to join the conversation. So we'll head out to California and talk to Mary. Mary, thank you for joining us today.
Hello. I just wanted to say I agree with the caller before. I would just go ahead and vote for the man and wait it out, because it sounds like dirty politics to me, which, you know, between Trump and Clinton, he grabbed some woman, but then everybody seemed to ignore that over in Haiti, a little foreign country, she's running a pay-for-play sex thing with child trafficking, sex trafficking. But everybody wanted to ignore that. You know, oh, he grabbed a woman. Well, which is the worst? You know, you talk about evil, there you are. There's true evil. But, and this, again, here we are, the Democrats again, pushing, oh, he assaulted a woman. Well, how long ago was that? Is she under psychiatric care? Did her psychiatrist prompt her to talk about it? Because I know I was a rape victim at 9 years of age, and until years later, almost 30 years later, under psychiatric care, did I ever tell anyone that it happened to me. But that was under a psychiatrist's care. And that's a lot different than these women just all jumping on the bandwagon, all of a sudden trying to make a name for themselves and do this and, you know, either get money or it's political. I just think that they would
we're kind of losing you there, but I think I got the point. You know, to be fair to these women, what I have heard is that the Washington Post went to them and they were somewhat hesitant to share that. Now, let's be honest that when you had the Republican primary, Luther Strange's campaign said that there had been some rumors about this. So maybe those rumors had floated around for a while, and it was only the Washington Post that was able to nail them down. But Mary's comment is helpful, and that is sometimes women that have been assaulted, been abused, been raped, been harassed, whatever, they just want to get on with their lives. They don't want to talk about it anymore. They don't want to bring it up. They maybe even never have told anybody. So there's a sense in which just because we find out at the 11th hour doesn't necessarily mean it isn't true. But at the same time, the Washington Post waited till at least after it was impossible to remove Roy Moore's name off of the ballot, because you could have put Luther Strange back on. That didn't take place. But again, let's take some more phone calls and give a few more of you a chance to weigh in with your comments. 1-800-351-1212. In Texas, KBJS, Josephine, thank you for joining us today.
Hi. My opinion is I will still vote for Roy Moore because he's a proven Christian conservative, and he has been in the news for so many years about the Ten Commandments in Alabama and other things that he was controversial in the news. But this issue today was brought up by the left, and they're trying to destroy him because they don't want him in the Senate and they don't want him to win. And this has been all of a sudden that they show this up. The timing is not very good.
Well, good point.
Hello?
And again, a lot of that has to do with the timing, and a lot of people have been bringing up the timing. Now, the timing maybe isn't related to the women as much as it's related to the Washington Post. But again, let's go back and give a few more of you a chance real quickly to join our conversation. In Georgia, Jacob, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, thank you, Kerby. Kerby, I was thinking about what is happening to Judge Roy Moore. This man is a Christian. I believe he's a Christian from the bottom of his heart. And I think the church and I think all Christians should stand behind him. Because when I look at Paul, who wrote 13 books in the Bible, there was no allegations on him. He was guilty of persecuting the church, having Christians killed. But yet and still, we go to the Bible and we read his letters. And I think we need to look at that. Judge Roy Moore has did more in his time to help out religious freedom and help us to stand on the principles of the Bible. And I think Christians got to stop judging him just from an allegation. and they have to start looking at the Bible was wrote by sinners. Everybody was involved.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to read the Psalms and think about what David did. It's kind of hard to read, like you said, the epistles by Paul and recognize what he did to the other fellow Christians. And you just have to understand that in the best circumstances, we'd love to have a candidate of good character who is right on the issues and who, especially if they're in the executive branch, is going to appoint key people to positions of authority. When you're talking about a senator, you're just looking at their stand on the issues and their character primarily, because of course, in some cases they're going to in the Senate confirm or deny some people to the Supreme Court. And I would love 3 out of 3. Sometimes you're lucky you even get 2 out of 3. Sometimes maybe only 1 out of 3. So I'm fully aware of the fact that sometimes you don't exactly have the best character in some of the people who vote at least the way in which you would agree. And so that's part of it. And I think your point's well taken. We don't know what we don't know, although it's looking worse every day for Roy Moore in light of some of these various accusers that are coming forward.
Yes, and I think that's where Christians got to come to that. And we got to stand up all over the world, and we got to let these accusers know that God is a forgiving God. Even if he did that, God is a forgiving God. And this man was like in his 30s when these things supposedly happened. And we have pastors, preachers, bishops, and everything has done worse, but yet and still they pastor in church.
Good point.
So we got to look at this there.
Let's take another phone call real quickly. I'm going to go to Illinois, WPEO. John, you got about a minute. What would you like to add to our conversation?
Okay. Well, we're all innocent until proven guilty. We have someone accused, and all the press talks about alleged behavior. Well, what we have here is gossip and rumor, and we're jumping on this guy. Let this lady or these ladies take this to the prosecuting attorney and ask for an indictment and criminal charges to be brought before the people and prove this man guilty. We've got him guilty. We've got a House full of and Senate full of Republicans that all the press has to do is say boo, and they all crawl under the bed. That's what's wrong with our government. It's the same thing that's happening in our judiciary.
Yep.
This has got to stop.
It is.
This slander and defamation of character has to stop.
And again, if we don't recognize how important it is to stop some of these guilty by allegation, then you're going to have more of these. And as I've said before, even if this turns out that everything that these accusers have said about Roy Moore is true, there's a broader principle, and that is when we drop these things in at the 11th hour, and when we have these so-called October surprises for a November election, in this case it'd be the November surprise for a December election, there's never a chance for a person to go back and get their good name back. He is losing endorsements. He's losing money. And, of course, as we well know, the Democrats don't even want him elected. A lot of the establishment Republicans don't want him elected. So this just is a fulfilling prophecy for some of them. Wish I had more time, but we simply have run out of time today. We'll cover maybe a little of that tomorrow, but some of the other issues we did not get into about the tax code and gun control, we'll just postpone till tomorrow. Hope you've appreciated the conversation today, and we will have more of it all through the week. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. See you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
You're riding down the road, and just ahead you see an elderly woman tumble off the curb into the street. As your friend drives past, she prays, "Lord, please send someone to help that poor woman," and drives on. What if that was your mother or grandmother? In Christ, our family includes people like Sarah. Sarah was 95 years old, and she didn't tumble into a street. She was forced into it because ISIS was coming. Countless Christians like Sarah are suffering in the Middle East, the birthplace, the cradle of Christianity, and we refuse to pass on by. We urge you to stop with us for just a moment and lend a helping hand to persecuted Christians through the Cradle Fund. Visit pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. Our Middle Eastern family needs us. Stop and give right now. Pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347